just introduce Clive, our speaker for tonight. Many of you actually know him, but he comes from a military background in the Royal Signals and also a period of time in the Hertfordshire Constabulary, a prolific author. I can recommend all of his books and has appeared on TV many, many times, the Time Team, Time Watch, and so on. He's probably even more well known for being a battlefield guide, and because of his work, he was elected onto the British Commission for Military History in 2010. And like many of us, he has completed a master's degree in war studies. Mine was at Birmingham, but his was at Wolverhampton, but we're not rivals. And he is incredibly knowledgeable about all sorts of things, but particularly Gallipoli, and he's going to lead us with his presentation tonight from the Dardanelles to the Caspian Sea. Okay, so over to you, Clive.
Well, thank you, Ian, and thank you everyone for tuning in tonight. I know there's an awful lot of other attractions at the moment you could be doing, so hopefully this next hour will be quite a rewarding one for you. I'm absolutely obsessed with the Great War and Gallipoli campaign in particular. Those of you that know me know that's the case, and really my interest and passion for studying the Great War. It's now over 40 years old, not bad as I'm only 53. Throughout that period, really, there are three chapters in the Great War in particular that I tend to return to time and time again, and they are the Gallipoli campaign, the Palestine campaign, and also the Zeebrugge raid. The reasons why they stand out for me is that I've always felt that what can be largely a dark canvas of the Great War, these tend to cut through that industrial destruction that you see on the Western Front. It's almost like infrequent splashes of colour that catch my eye as campaigns. So I keep revisiting them and finding more and more out. And in fact, our subject tonight, Eric, actually features in some capacity in all three of those. I've done quite a lot of these Zoom presentations over the last year or so, you can imagine, and more recent papers that I've written or conferences that I've lectured at, they tend to focus largely on operational aspects of the war, and they've been delivered in somewhat of an academic fashion where you set out questions and you feature learning points and end with a conclusion. But tonight's subject, Eric, it reads far more like a boy's own story, one that really wouldn't be out of place on the Victor comic, as you can see there, which I have to confess was one of my primary source materials when I was a young lad that got me interested in history in general. What I often find with the Great War is that it can be dramatic, it can be overwhelming, it can be uplifting, tragic, heroic, and also quite a tremendously humbling experience to delve into. Without doubt, though Eric only really occupies a footnote in the official history of the Great War, the life of Eric Gascoigne Kipper Robinson is all of those things I've described above. You know, he lived, he loved, he lost through what was an absolutely fantastic period of our long history. And so tonight, what I'm going to do is hopefully share part of his story with you. And where it really begins here is similar to my own, which is here in the Riverside borough of Greenwich. You can see as a local lad, I've called it Greenwich, not Greenwich, that's for posh people. We always say Greenwich. And of being of Southeast London roots myself, I know the area well. I've grown up in the area long enough, and it hugs that southern bend of Old Father Thames there you see in the top of the map on the left-hand side. And it's neighboured, that's an old map, it's a lot more populated obviously today. It's really neighboured by heavy and light industry and rows of housings in communities all around that part of Southeast London where life was pretty much dependent on the river. Yet at the very heart of Greenwich itself, we have Christopher Wren's rather stunning Naval College, and that leads up to the observatory itself, the walled gardens of Greenwich Park, and then that quite pleasant village of Blackheath just to the south there, just at the bottom of the screen. And all of these factors really soften, brighten, and somewhat smarten up the landscape in general. However, flanking those walls on Greenwich Park You have smart Georgian houses like the row that you see here. They once housed naval officers and sea captains, and they provide quite smart respectability to the area. This is, I have to say, far removed from the estates and the tower blocks that my own family occupied. Certainly the estates from there lived in the area from about 1720 when they first moved to settle on Deptford Creek and work in the shipbuilding industry. But it was on one of these smart streets, like the one you see here, that Eric enters the world. It was called Diamond Terrace. It was within sight of the Ranger's house and almost slap bang on the middle of the Meridian line. One of the things I am fairly convinced of, though, is just as when I was a child, Eric would have been taken on walks through that wonderful Greenwich Park, and he would have stopped at General Wolfe's statue and no doubt marvelled over the unbroken views of our capital, the City of London and beyond. And he would have seen that red ball drop from Flamstead House at 1 o'clock every day, and no doubt wondered at that fact that Greenwich is the place where time and navigation begins. Real reason that Eric grew up here was his father. I'll introduce you to him now. This is the Reverend John Lovell Robinson. He was born in County Cork in 1849. He studied theology at Trinity College in Dublin up to master's level, and then was appointed as an instructor to the Royal Navy in 1871. Now, initially, he was part of the Channel Squadron and was then promoted to chaplain as a naval instructor to HMS Rover, which is the ship you can see there on the right of the screen. Rover was stationed in the far more exotic North America and West Indies stations, so he got to see a far bit of the world while he was there. It was in 1879 that he actually took a posting up at the Naval College in Greenwich, and here he taught acting sub-lieutenants in mathematics, amongst other things. It was during this period where John Lovell was also published a couple of times, usually writing on technical matters that were useful to young naval officers. One of his books that I've put in the middle there, Elements of Marine Surveying in 1888, remains still in print today, so that's quite some effort. One of his young students during this period, of course, was the George V, who actually wrote him a couple of letters in his life. Eric's father was not only the only military influence really on his life, as well as having his father John, his maternal grandfather, John Hawkins Gascoigne, who came from nearby Charlton, which is exactly where my family's from, was a major general in the Royal Marines. He'd seen active service in the Crimea and also in China, and he was quite an accomplished watercolor artist. And you can just see an example of one of his works there, a view of Halifax Harbour that is on display today in the Canadian collection. It was from his grandfather that Eric took that middle name of Gascoigne. So Eric's schooling really is important. It may be where he first gets this nickname Kipper. We're pretty uncertain of the exact reasons for the nickname. It's often suggested, and it seems likely, that it may have been to do with the fact that he was always smoking. Certainly a lot of the pictures show him smoking, but I doubt that would have really gone back to his school days, so there might be another reason. He went to this school here, which is St John's in Leatherhead in Surrey. It was originally an educational facility for sons of poor clergymen. However, by the time Eric arrived here in the 1890s, that was pretty much far from the case, and there were quite a few wealthy families putting their children through the establishment as well. It provided numerous national sportsmen of the day, sportsmen of distinction, notably rugby players and cricketers that would go on to play for their country. Eric himself, of course, favoured hockey as his sport and was quite a proficient hockey player at school and at his time in the forces. Two characters of note that I've singled out there either side of him that would have been at the school the same time as Eric. Well, the chap on the left you can see there, handsome chap with the army tunic on, that's Geoffrey Woolley. Now, Woolley, who was the son of a reverend, obviously went to that school, actually didn't follow his father initially into the cloth. He enlisted in the army, the 9th Battalion of the London Regiment, Queen Victoria Rifles, and actually became the first territorial officer to be awarded a Victoria Cross at Hill 60 in April 1915. It was only later that he then became a padre himself and actually wrote his memoirs in the 1920s. The chap you see on the right is perhaps lesser known, Paymaster Joseph Gedge. Now, Gedge actually became the first British officer to die in World War I. This is when HMS Amphion was sunk after striking a mine as early as the 6th of August 1914. Shortly after, it had already pursued and sunk the German mine layer, the SS Königin Luise, which was quite a story at the time. It then struck one of the mines and went down. The Gedge Medal is still awarded within the Navy for the accountants branch for anyone that shows professional merit. So Gedge is remembered within the Navy today. When he left school in 1897, Eric joined HMS Britannia. This was an officers' travelling training establishment, I should say, which was close to the entrance to the River Dart. When we say establishment, you can see the sort of stuff that we're looking at here. Britannia was, in fact, a wooden hull, a historic wooden hull at that. One of them was for training. It would previously been the 131-gun HMS Prince of Wales, and it had now been converted pretty much into a floating college. And alongside that was a similarly aged vessel, HMS Hindustan, that provided accommodation for the cadets. Now, during this period, it has to say that this training may well have been a real shock to the system of young Eric. Alongside the practical skills of Navy life that needed to be learned, there was a real sort of attention was paid to fitness and discipline, and these were perhaps the cornerstone of that initial military training. Reveille started as early as 0630 when a bugle sounded to wake everyone up, and this was sharply followed by a quick dip into the River Dart. Must have been freezing cold in those days before your lessons began. There were endless physical training and inspections, and perhaps the playing of hockey would have come as somewhat a welcome relief for young Eric at the time. Something that would have been quite useful for him was in the year he joined up, coincided with the Spithead Naval Review of 1897. This was to commemorate Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee. Now, by this stage in history, I'm sure we're aware that the Royal Navy was in fact the dominant maritime power on the globe. And there was a combined force of 165 ships present. To that date was the greatest armada the modern world had seen. It was crewed by some 38,000 naval personnel and would have made quite an awe-inspiring sight for any of the young cadets who were lucky enough to have been sent along to see it. One notable event that day was what's described as the Turbinia incident. Now, if you look at the blurry image you can see on the right, I agree it's blurry, but it's important because it's contemporary. This records this moment when Charles Parsons decided to launch a publicity stunt to demonstrate what was quite a new revolutionary steam turbine engine. Just at the start of the review, as the bands were striking up, this small craft of his, the Turbinia, arrived amongst the fleet and at outstanding speed started to race in and amongst the vessels. Now, this caused a few security concerns, you could imagine, and picket boats were dispatched but could not actually capture or catch up the Turbinia at any stage. In fact, she was going so fast that at one stage, it was in danger of overturning the picket boat that had gone out to stop her. The important thing about this is that within a decade, the Royal Navy had actually adopted Charles Parsons' steam turbines for their new Dreadnought class of ships. And I think this is important that Eric Robinson, we believe, witnessed what was a significant moment in naval history. It's fair to say this would not be the last time that this would occur. The following year, 1898, and midshipman Robinson, as he was then, joined HMS Majestic, that you can see on the left. This was a relatively new first-class battleship that was armed with 4 12-inch guns and 10 6-inch guns. It was in fact the flagship of the Channel Fleet. It was the largest pre-dreadnought when she was launched in 1895, and actually came under the command of Vice Admiral Sir Harry Rawson. Rawson was a strict disciplinarian. Eric Robinson would have learned hard and fast the ways under his command of how to behave as a young naval officer. Now, here's this little trivia war that I didn't know about until researching this a few days ago. Rawson would actually be the commanding officer in the Anglo-Zanzibar War. Now, what makes this quite fascinating for me is that this is the shortest war in history. It lasted for just 38 minutes on the 27th of August, 1896. I no doubt that anyone who was going to give us a presentation on it, the presentation would last longer than the war itself. Throughout Eric Robinson's time, it was fairly brief. He spent just under a year on the ship. However, he would be reacquainted with her in 1915 whilst during the Dardanelles campaign. It was at Gallipoli, of course, that the Majestic would be heavily engaged pretty much from start till her finish. She was engaged with the preliminary bombardment on the inner forts in late February. She was hit 4 times during the attempt to force the Narrows on the 18th of March. She was the vessel that signalled to London that the landings had started on the 25th of April. And then on the 27th of May, herself met an untimely end when she was struck by a torpedo that was fired by the U-21. And you can see her on the right there keeling over. Within 9 minutes, she'd actually keeled over with a loss of 49 men. And for a long period of the campaign, she was visible because she literally sat upside down with her mast stuck in the sandbank. And it was only during a storm that snapped, that she sunk beneath the water level. Returning to Eric Robinson, though, at just 17, he got his first real overseas posting when he sailed east on what was his new ship, the one you can see on the picture here, HMS Endymion. This was going off to China Station in June 1899 and arrived there just in time for the Boxer Rebellion. The Endymion was an armoured cruiser. It had 9.2 and 6-inch guns, also 4 18-inch torpedo tubes, a weapon system that Eric would excel at later in his career. Now, the Boxer Rebellion really would take me over an hour to just explain. It's quite a complex conflict, one that's rooted in long simmering tension over Britain and other foreign powers' colonial activities in the region, alongside what was a cultural clash between Christian missionaries conflicting with traditional Chinese beliefs. It really all came to a head with a series of riots in German-controlled China. These were rapidly quashed with extremely harsh reprisals, including shooting quite a number of the local peasants and the burning of villages. And this led to the nationalist movement that grew out of this unrest being named the Society of the Righteous and Harmonious Fists. These were known to the Westerners as the Boxers. And as the attacks on Western missionaries increased, the pro-West Empress at the time, Cixi, who you can see here on the left, initially outlawed the Boxers as a group. The West, however, demanded rather harsher treatment and threatened military force unless she stepped in. Initially, Cixi resisted this and, realizing her own forces were no match for foreign military, accepted some rather poor advice from her cabinet to try and get the Boxers to come under imperial control and impose what was fast becoming a multinational force gathering in the region. Quickly, any perceived control she thought she had over the Boxers diminished, and by the spring of 1900, literally thousands of Boxers roamed the streets of Beijing, calling for death to any foreigner that was there. This would the real emphasis on the Western nations here was the fact that a lot of their embassies were being seized at this stage. And I think Cixi, fearing that a bloodletting would lead to international catastrophe, a response that they wouldn't be able to cope with in China, she actually turned full circle and allowed Admiral Seymour to travel from Tientsin up to Beijing to try and protect those diplomatic groups that were under siege. The group size she agreed to was 400 people. However, Admiral Seymour decided he'd like few more than that and actually brought along around about 2,000 sailors of the Marines, amongst whom was the newly arrived Eric Robinson. It's fair to say the train journey was not straightforward. You can see that artist's impression here. Its sabotage and attack was commonplace every few miles, and what really started off as a relief force quickly became a full-blown war against Imperial China. As the train approached Beijing, it was attacked by a sizable force of Chinese regular troops. The occupants of the train formed a defensive position along the tracks, and in one letter home, Kipper Robinson described as hearing the bullets hissing overhead. Both sides then entered a firefight. Once the Marines had the upper hand, a counterattack was pressed through a series of charges, and this was only stopped when the charge was only stopped to fire volleys into the now retiring Chinese ranks. It was during this period that Kipper himself received a slight wound to his arm, and also a round passed through his Wolseley helmet. The route back to Tientsin, where they'd come from, had now been cut, and reinforcements reaching them was entirely unrealistic. So it was on the 21st of June that CC also formally declared war on all foreign powers, including Kipper's group that was now sieged around the train just outside of Beijing. With this news, Admiral Seymour decided the best course of action would be to abandon the train in total and fight their way back on foot by following the Hai River. They were harassed each day by both regular forces and also Chinese forces. The fight in retirement really came to a head as the column passed what was the Imperial Army arsenal, a place called Siku. Here, initially, they were promised safe passage. The group were soon fired upon from the fortress walls, however, and a desperate battle ensued before Seymour's men actually managed to capture some of the Chinese guns and turn them back onto their enemy. They had a Marine force that then also outflanked the hesitant Chinese and enabled Seymour to occupy the arsenal. Once they all got inside what was this fortress of an arsenal, it became a gift of a position, really. No matter how many people sieged them and surrounded them, all of these counterattacks were beaten off. And it was finally on the 25th of June that some Cossacks led a relief force to break the siege. Once after the siege had finished, they managed to make their way back to those original ports. We now had a multinational group that consisted of Russians, Japanese, British, French, and US forces, amongst others. There were eight nations in particular. Empress Sisi now found herself in a rather an enviable position of resisting foreign power and interventions, while at the same time fearing and not trusting her own forces, specifically those that were Boxers themselves. And it was on the 4th of August 1900, as part of a 20,000 strong force, that our hero here, Eric Robinson, marched on the Central Army at a place called Peisang. And after a short engagement here, the Chinese forces broke up and retired. And it was during this retirement that for a second time, Eric was wounded again, this time in the upper arm. It was no doubt a decisive victory, and it effectively ended any Chinese resistance. In fact, by the 14th, the Beijing was relieved and the war was now over. Now China was back in a more position of stability. Kipper actually remained in the region for a couple of years, patrolling the Yangtze River in a gunboat like the one we see here. And by the time we get to 1903, he was actually promoted to lieutenant. Now, I should say that I myself have traveled up the Yangtze River as a youngster when I was traveling, and was intrigued by these sort of gunboats that would have passed across that ground all that time earlier. By 1905, he's now back in the UK and undergoing torpedo training at Portchester. And it's around this time that he married Edith, or a few years later. He was promoted to lieutenant commander, and he settled down to a rather pleasant life, having 3 children. And in August 1914, however, as you can imagine, this was all due to change with the declaration of war. It's fair to say that the initial year of the war, 1914, was rather frustrating for Eric as an individual. He at this time was serving on HMS Amethyst, part of the 7th Cruiser Squadron that was patrolling the North Sea. His commander, future Admiral of the Fleet Reginald Tyrwhitt, who you can see here, did not see eye to eye at all with Eric. It was rather welcome news, in fact, that when the commander actually transferred his flagship off to the faster Arethusa vessel. This decision, however, did leave to Eric and the slower Amethyst missing out on what was the first significant naval battle of the war at Heligoland Bight. They witnessed the sinking of 6 German ships, but Eric, as he said, was a mere observer and wrote home of the battle, "War is horrible, but I wish I'd not missed it." He really had a desire to take a more hands-on approach, and this opportunity came for him in late September 1914 when he was transferred as the torpedo officer to HMS Vengeance that you see here. This was a 1899 pre-dreadnought battleship of the Canopus class, initially built for service in Asia, lightly armoured, but armoured with the far more efficient Krupp steel, and had a main armament of 12-inch guns backed up by Sinchik guns, numerous quick-firing guns for our own protection, and 4 torpedo tubes, which were going to be Eric's responsibility. Now, not being on a dreadnought and serving in the Grand Fleet may initially have felt a bit like a sideways move for Eric, but without him realising, this posting provided not only his potential survival, but potentially a platform to sort of thrive with his own career. Just a day after he left the ship on the 22nd of September, disaster would strike when his colleagues in the 7th Battle Squadron he'd just left behind, who were nicknamed the Lifebait Squadron due to Churchill, due to their role to encourage the German fleet out into battle, instead showed what naval vulnerability there was to submarine attack. Within hours, 3 large ships, the Aboukir, the Hogue and the Cressy, were sunk with a combined loss of 1,459 lives. That's quite incredible, isn't it? Within hours. All are commemorated today on the Chatham Memorial. This wasn't the end of it. Just weeks later, while he's on his way to Suez to join his new ship, he received the, again, sad dispatch that his older brother Ernest, who had actually been a merchant seaman P&O before the war, but as a member of the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve, was aboard HMS Hawke when she too was torpedoed off of the Scottish coast on the 15th of October 1914. Again, it was the U-9 that sunk Hogue, Cressy and Aboukir that also sunk the Hawke and one of the few survivors actually recalled, "We were struck amidships between the 2 funnels, quite close to one of the magazines. All hands were on deck, and it was a terrible explosion. The vessel immediately took a heavy list to starboard. I've never been on a ship so well equipped with life-saving apparatus, but the way the vessel heeled over made it almost impossible to get the boats out. The boat I was in was saved and had a narrow escape from being taken down with a suction. We were struck about 11 o'clock in the forenoon, and just as we got away from the Hawke, we distinctly saw the periscope of the enemy's submarine come to the surface. We thought he was going to ram us, but apparently he was on the lookout for any other rescuing vessels. Prior to the accident, Hawke was cruising about in zigzag fashion. We never saw the submarine until we felt her. It was beginning to get hazy when we were almost run down by a Norwegian steamer which picked us up. This boat, after effecting the rescue, cruised about in search of the rafts, but nothing was seen." Incidentally, HMS Hawke had already found infamy when it collided with the White Star liner, the Olympic, in 1911. However, a court of inquiry quickly cleared the Hawke of any blame. For Kipper Robinson, however, now, this war had suddenly become a very personal one. In January 1915, the Vengeance and Kipper Robinson on board left Suez for the Dardanelles. Here he'd be reunited with someone who he considered an old pal. You see on the left there, Roger Keyes. The pair had not only served together during the Boxer Rebellion, but also pre-war when Keyes had commanded the submarine force at Harwich. Kipper's knowledge of explosives, gained during his torpedo training at HMS Vernon, and his obvious coolness under flyer that he demonstrated continually in China, made him stand out to Roger Keyes, and he was the ideal man for what would have been a very dangerous task ahead. This task was to allow the naval force to enter and pass through the Dardanelles, by which doing so we needed to put minesweepers out to clear the straits. However, in turn, the minesweepers were subjected to fire from fixed and mobile shore forts. In short, to make more sense, the Navy could not capture the forts without clearing the mines, and the minesweepers couldn't clear the mines because they were fired on by the forts. So it was decided, with very few land, if any, land forces available, that naval raiding parties of sailors and marines would land and try and destroy these guns. And as I say, Roger Keyes had no hesitation in selecting Kipper Robinson to lead one of those first raiding parties. The site chosen was the one you see here on the map at the bottom of the screen between Cwmcarley and Tepi number 4. It was in the shadow of the ruins of ancient Troy, and it was close to Cwmcarley, where of course the French would land just weeks later. It was the morning of the 26th of February when a small party led by Kipper was landed just to the north of the position marked number 4 on the map and began to head south down the coast towards a battery that had been identified from those on the top of the deck of HMS Vengeance. Before long, they came under fire. Sergeant Turnbull at this stage becoming the first land casualty of the Gallipoli campaign. And let's go back there a little while. Naval gunfire was the only thing that could really support them at this stage. They fired at a local village, destroyed several windmills, but it was still small arms fire that was coming in on his party from numerous directions. Robinson, and these photographs are taken when I was up there just a couple of years ago over the ground. You can see that I'm actually in one of the Turkish positions on top of this mound. Robinson was very conspicuous, wearing a naval white uniform, as were all the rest of his party, and they continued on towards this position where you can see me sat here. It was in fact, and just to make it even more evocative, as Gallipoli so often is, an ancient burial ground, reputed to be the burial place of the Greek hero Achilles. This was where they believed these Turkish fire guns had their fire base. As Robinson neared the slope, he himself alone went forward, armed with a bag of explosives and a number of fuses, in full sight of both the naval observers out to sea and the Turkish defenders in and around this battery. He located a 75mm gun, which he alone destroyed. He then headed further up the coast towards Orhenay Fort number 4, which had been luckily abandoned the night before. Here he found a 240mm fortress gun, which was also destroyed before he returned his party under fire to the awaiting boats, and they managed to get away, supported by more naval gunfire from HMS Vengeance. The fort's still there, and hopefully this is one of the places we're going to visit on the next association tour in the spring. One witness to the event described Robinson as, and it's a wonderful description this, strolling around under heavy rifle fire like a sparrow enjoying a bath from a garden hose. Isn't that a lovely description? For this, and also for his participation in an action that we're going to talk about very shortly, he would be awarded the Victoria Cross. The citation actually read, Lieutenant Commander Robinson, on the 26th of February, advanced alone under heavy fire and into an enemy's gun position, which may well have been occupied. He destroyed a 4-inch gun, returning to his party for another charge, with which the second gun was destroyed. Lieutenant Commander Robinson would not allow members of his demolition party to accompany him, as their white uniforms rendered them very conspicuous. Lieutenant Colonel Robinson, Commander Robinson, sorry, took part in 4 attacks on the minefields, always under heavy fire. And it's to those that we really turn to now. Within a few weeks, in fact, we're talking the 13th, 14th March, 1915, Kipper was at it once again. This time, he volunteered to command a trawler manned by fellow volunteers from the Vengeance to sweep the minefields at the entrance to the Dardanelles. They were pretty quickly spotted by searchlights, and rapid fire ripped into these small trawlers that they were occupying. His own trawler was in fact hit 84 times, but 3 times, regardless of this, he sailed back into the beaten zone with the intention of clearing a path through the mines. Despite the incredible bravery shown by him and his crew, it was pretty much to no avail. As we know, the decision was taken shortly after to force the Dardanelles by naval power, planned for the 18th of March, a plan itself which was ultimately to fail. Where ships failed, however, submarines could penetrate the Narrows. Norman Holbrook had first achieved this in December 1914, when the B-11 managed to get up and sink the Masudi, for which he was awarded the Victoria Cross. By now, however, we had the more modern E-class submarines in theatre, and on the 17th of April 1915, Lieutenant Commander Brodie attempted to break into the Sea of Marmara in E-15. Shortly after starting her journey, however, or entering the straits, strong currents forced her to run aground close to Fort Dardanos, where she quickly came under fire. Brodie and 6 of his men were killed before the remainder were taken prisoner. And you can see there in the middle there the picture of them as prisoners. Brodie himself buried in the Consulate Cemetery at the back of Chinakali, and then back to that more sort of comics from when I was a boy of the Victor. What happened now was it became imperative really to the Brits or the Allies out there to try and destroy the E-15 before it would fall into Turkish hands. The way they set about this was for these steam-powered picket boats, like the one you see here, from HMS Triumph and from Majestic, it would be fitted out with a single torpedo. Despite their slow speed, their shallow draft would enable them to get close up to the E-15 before launching the weapons to sink it. One was commanded by Lieutenant Goodwin, the other was by Eric Robinson. He commanded the second boat that actually came from HMS Triumph, and they set off just before midnight. Once again, as soon as they got into their journey, searchlights spotted them fairly early on and blinded the 2 commanders. Despite coming under heavy fire for over an hour, Robinson continued to creep slowly towards the E-15. He was struggling to find his target, so in the end he fired his torpedo blindly towards where he assumed it would be, and it missed. Goodwin tried the same and had better luck. This time the torpedo did strike the E-15, striking its conning tower, but not actually sinking or destroying the vessel. It was as both pickets returned for home that Goodwin's vessel was hit by a direct shell and began to sink. Without any hesitation again, Eric Robinson turned his picket boat around and, despite being under very heavy fire himself, returned to rescue the stricken comrades. The Times initially reported the incident as a brilliant naval episode. Turks were foiled. If you look at this, there's a picture of the Turk troops on the E-15 long after the action. You can actually see in the conning tower there the hole which was caused by Goodwin's torpedo as he launched it towards a submarine. The Times continued, the country will read with pride and admiration the story of the brilliant exploit of the volunteer crews of the picket boats, the Triumph and the Majestic. Very satisfactory piece of work, rivals in daring and audacity the finest cutting achievements of the old seaman. No incident of war better illustrates the living presence of the fleet today, of the spirit of the old Navy. It was not only the British that marvelled at this bravery. Ernest Roschmann, who was a German diver attempting to salvage the rescue at the vessel at the time, said, "I have never in the course of the war seen an attack carried out with such pluck and fearlessness." And Roger Keyes, who can be blunt at times, is another great hero of mine, confessed, "I am honestly lost in admiration for Robinson. He has done splendidly, and honestly, I'm very surprised. I did not think much of him as a first lieutenant, but that evidently does not prevent him from being an exceedingly brave man." Now, Stephen hinted at this before the talk started, but a number of people present were actually awarded decorations, DSOs, Distinguished Service Medals, and it was suggested that Robinson's actions here might have merited a bar to the Victoria Cross. Sadly, that wasn't awarded. He was, in fact, promoted in the field to commander. Now, after this incident, initially he goes back to Imbros for a while, but after the Gallipoli landings on the 25th of April, Robinson served briefly at Anzac, the theatre you obviously recognise and see here, as the Naval Transport Officer. He landed on the 6th of August 1915, and was badly wounded just a day and a half later, late into the evening of the 7th of August. And this actually forced his eventual evacuation away from the Gallipoli campaign. So severe was the wound. And this is that photo that you saw earlier of him that some of you commented on, wearing his Saturday Night Fever outfit. And you can see how badly wounded he was. This was taken on his evacuation back towards Blighty after his experience in the Dardanelles. When he recovered from his wounds, Eric was actually given command to the vessel you see there on the left. This is Monitor 21, initially intended as a shore bombardment vessel. It was actually equipped with a 9.2-inch gun that you can see there. And this has been taken from HMS Theseus. Now, in a little twist of fate, the Theseus was the sister ship of HMS Hawke, which, if you recall, was the ship that Eric Spravell was serving on when he lost his life. And I'm sure that wouldn't have been lost on Eric. It was present off of Palestine, and it supported the Second Battle of Gaza in March 1917, where it fired both gas and HE shells onto the Ottoman positions. And for his part in this action at Gaza, he was awarded the Order of the Nile. The M21 itself would actually strike a mine off of Ostend in October 1918. Though it was towed back towards Dover, it sank and still lays just off the shore of the West Pier. By this stage, however, Kipper had transferred to a very different type of craft, and one that you could argue far more suited his own personality, that of coastal motorboats. Now, coastal motorboats really are quite incredible vessels. They would play a significant role in the latter stages of the war, specifically at the Zeebrugge raid on St. George's Day in 1918. And in fact, you can see some of those vessels coming back from the Zeebrugge raid in the top left-hand of the photograph. Kipper Robertson was desperate to be involved in Zeebrugge, as many Gallipoli men were. However, Roger Keyes felt that due to his wounds, he would not be appropriate for the actual action. He did, however, put him in charge of training coastal motorboats, and a number of the crews involved would have been trained by Robinson himself. One of those was, in fact, the local MP for Greenwich, where he hailed from, Sir Ian Hamilton Benn, who would lead a coastal motorboat in Ostend that would obviously will go on to him being awarded the DSO for his own actions there. By the time we came to the armistice, however, Kipper himself had not used one of these vessels in anger. Now, these really are the predecessors of motor torpedo boats of the Second World War. And you can see from my notes there that they have a Lewis gun, they have one torpedo on board, they are 55 foot long towards the end of the war, can reach a speed of over 70 knots, and are powered by a specific Thornycroft Vespa nautical engine. We say he hadn't used one by the end of the war. This is going to change, however, in January 1919, when he's actually dispatched to command 12 coastal motorboats out to the Caspian Sea, where Russian Bolsheviks were now posing quite a serious threat to the Royal Navy. Now, where is the Caspian Sea? Certainly, it's not somewhere in my schoolboy geography that I was able to identify. But it's actually the world's largest inland body of water. It stretches some 1,200 kilometers from north to south. To get there, and his 12 coastal motorboats, one of the things that Kipper had to do was get himself out back through the Dardanelles. And how would he have felt as he was slipping up there through the Sea of Marmara, this time without opposition, into the Black Sea itself, across the Black Sea to the little port of Batumi. And if you look on the map on the left there, you can see that sort of circle that says British. That was the part we controlled. And from there, these coastal motorboats were then transported by rail overland from Batumi to Baku on the edge of the Caspian Sea. Baku, the sort of place that I'd really not heard of until very recently, when they started playing Champions League games and things out there, haven't they? I think so. It's might even have been is it an Olympic venue? certainly come to note recently. Now, what were they doing there in the first place? Well, the mission was twofold, really. Like all things in Britain, we tend to have a public reason for going to these sort of conflicts. The real public reason we gave out was to support the anti-Bolshevik governments of Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia. However, I think it's fair to say from Admiralty papers that the real objectives were firstly to seize Krasnoyarsk, and that was the terminal of the Trans-Caspian Railway, which was very important to us. And the second, and perhaps more pressing reason, was actually to prevent the Baku oil fields from falling into German or Ottoman control. Now, initially, when he arrived, Robinson set up his headquarters in the hospital at Baku. He was given time, if nothing else. The nature of what was an iced up port in Astrakhan, which is where most of the Bolshevik naval force was occupying, allowed him time really to plan his operation, knowing that that was going to be iced up for at least until the spring, and there would be no threat whatsoever. More pressing, however, was the old Russian naval flotilla that was situated or still stationed at Baku. It sat there since the collapse of Russia. And one thing that happened is ill discipline had set in, and the British and the locals were both getting very concerned that at any moment these sailors may switch over to the Bolshevik side. The Russian commander at the time was a Colonel Vozdrensky, and he was told to surrender his fleet or face sinking. Robinson was ordered to escort those vessels out of the harbour and then from there take on the surrender. Now, despite orders to surrender being read out to each ship individually, when the deadline passed, there was no obvious signs for movement amongst any of the vessels. Robinson, again, not one to hang about, and you can see a coastal motorboat there on the bottom right flying the ensign, raced out to among the Russian ships and initially launched or immediately launched a torpedo. This torpedo ran deep and directly underneath the stern of the first Russian warship. We don't know whether this was a deliberate miss, a calculated miss by Robinson, or by accident, and actually he misjudged it and he was trying to strike the Russian ship. But either way, it galvanized the Russian crews to immediately surrender en masse. So shortly after this, that ice port that I mentioned of Astrakhan was open, and the time came to go out and meet that Bolshevik force. Initially, there were a number of skirmishes. The first real action took place on the 21st of May, 1919, when after a 90-minute engagement, 9 of those Bolshevik ships were either sunk or blown up. Commander Norris, the chap you see on the left there, claimed that the enemy had had a bloody good thumping. Just a day later, however, 2 of the undamaged ships, the Kruger and the Venture, were sighted. They were faster and they were able to outgun the British. Norris, at this stage, panicked somewhat and confessed that the Bolsheviks had got us cold and that our number was up. He immediately ordered Kipper to withdraw over the radio. Withdraw was not a word that Kipper Robinson actually had in his language. He ignored this and began to deploy his coastal motorboats directly towards the Russians. The Bolshevik commander, seeing the smoke on the horizon, concluded that he was being drawn into an attack, an ambush, and he quickly turned and fled. It was Kipper's bold disregard for orders on this occasion that no doubt saved the day. Just 5 days later, Kipper personally led a further attack on the remainder of the Bolshevik fleet. This was now in Alexandrovsk Harbour. Robinson personally sunk an armoured barge, and immediately on doing so, a white flag was spotted over the port and a deputation came out to surrender to the British. What was left of the Bolshevik navy soon withdrew to the safety of the Volga River and refused to show itself to the British again. Now, this is quite fascinating, what I'm about to tell you, in comparison with recent British foreign policy. Because back in London, Churchill reported a great British victory and decided on the spot to withdraw all British forces. He would hand over control to local troops. The Caspian War was actually far from over, but it was certainly over for the Royal Navy. Kipper left the area in September 1919, but by March 1920, just months later, the Bolshevik forces triumphed over the anti-Bolsheviks that we'd been supporting, and independence from Soviet control would not return until 1991. I found that quite chilling to read that when I thought about recent events in Afghanistan. For his own role in the campaign, Kipper Robinson was awarded the Order of St. Anne. He was also awarded the OBE and promoted to captain. Finally, however, and this is where I will bail out because my voice has given up, on returning home that spring, Eric Robinson's war was now over, but not his naval career. And as that rather intriguing photograph on the left suggested, that career would last for another 20 years. But that is another story for another day. And I think my voice has just about lasted out. So I'll ask Ian to come back on and save me quickly.
Okay, just clearing my throat. But thank you very much. Thank you very much, Clive, for a fantastic talk. Very, very entertaining, but very serious subject matter, of course. And beautifully illustrated in a really nice combination of personal stories as well as international explanations of complicated international events. I'm intrigued to find out about this 38-minute war, and I'll go on Wikipedia fairly soon and have a look at it. But thank you very much. And the photographs that you've gathered on that have really added to it. So that's really fantastic. Thank you very much. Before I go over to questions, President Christopher, if you can hear me, you might just want to say something about the grave, his grave, Christopher. At this point, you might find that Christopher's just nipped off to get a
no, he's there. I can see him reaching for them. My voice is recovered now. We could go again. Look, I'm back in the game.
Yes.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Certainly can.
I'm sorry.
I don't have an awful lot to say, but accepting that the VC Association decided that his grave had fallen into disrepair, and they arranged for it to be renovated, which it was. What's it called? Langrish, isn't it? Yes, Langrish, at Langrish. And they asked me to go and give a talk, well, an address at the service in the church, which I did, and it's a lovely spot. And you've seen the picture of the gravestone now.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, well, we don't have any questions on chat. I'll just put it on full view. And if anybody wants to raise their hand and ask a question, I'll shout out what is appearing on the screen.
I just must apologize for my voice then. That was unbelievable. That just suddenly, when it goes dry and nothing you could do could change it.
Being a former teacher, I can support that. When it goes, it just goes, and there's very little you can do there. Stephen, you're going to ask a question?
I was just fascinated. Bring my mic down so you can probably hear me.
Yes.
No, I was fascinated with that last photograph. He was standing. Was that next to de Gaulle?
Yeah, absolutely right, Steve. It was going to intrigue you. So what I found was that there was absolutely no way I could fit his life into an hour. It'd actually be about an hour and 20. But as we finished 3 minutes early, I'll just briefly tell you what occurs. He actually rejoins the Navy at the start of the war, and in 1940 is involved quite heavily in the Atlantic convoys. And it's during this period that he actually gets to meet de Gaulle, amongst other personalities. Of course, being the holder of Victoria Cross, he's often invited to these functions and what have you. Very rarely, sadly, his son is killed early on in the war. And it's on losing his son that I think that's the final straw for him. His wife had died in about 1937, I think, is when Edith died. You know, you think about he lost a brother in the First World War. He now loses a son. And eventually, I think it's 1942 that he retires for good. But he was based up in Dundee for quite a while and was involved in these Atlantic convoys. And I found it fascinating that whereas there's someone who's written a fantastic biography of him on the internet there. I wish I could meet the guy because he's got access clearly to lots of personal letters and what have you that I'd love to see. He makes this point very well, that you'd think that if you want to be places in history in the Great War, you would be on the Western Front, or if you're in the Navy, you'd be at Jutland and places in the First War. And then in the Second World War, you'd be involved in Dunkirk and all these sort of things. And actually, throughout his career, Robinson is always just on the fringes. He's in the Boxer Rebellion, not the Boer War. He's in Gallipoli and Palestine, not the Western Front. He's on the Atlantic, you know, up in the War of the Atlantic, and not actually down at Dunkirk. Yet despite that, he has the most amazing, fantastic life story. And, you know, Christopher, I'm so glad they've repaired the headstone there or sorted it out, because largely this is one character from Gallipoli that I think goes under the radar. So I don't know if you've got anything to add on that, Steve, but we don't hear a lot about him, do we?
No, I think you're right. Very, very little. And, I suppose apart from Unwin, a lot of the naval Victoria Cross holders for the Dardanelles, you don't hear much about. Even the submariners, who you would have thought would get more. But no, I was actually struck by that photograph. No, thanks for giving it context. One sort of sideline from that same image is: was he sitting down, or was he very short, or de Gaulle very tall?
I think he's. I think de Gaulle's a lot closer to the camera, Steve. That's what it is.
Yes, one would expect so. Yes. Yeah.
Great.
Okay.
Great, thank you.
Any other questions? Any other questions?
He's very recognisable, though, isn't he? From the same guy in the white sort of uniform. That's the thing. You're really distinctive looking face.
I just wonder if I may say,
Yes, one.
Because the naval campaign itself was deemed really such a failure, even though the whole thing was a failure. The whole idea of forcing the Narrows in the first place, I suppose, takes sort of second place in terms of failure. You tend to forget about all of the naval stuff, which is probably why we don't hear so much about him. Everything is about, well, not everything, but most things are about land. When you talk to Australians or New Zealanders, it's all about the land. But they were involved on submarines themselves.
Of course they
Australians were.
Yeah.
But I think it does get ignored slightly.
Yeah.
So just a statement, really, not a question.
Well, no, thanks for making it, Ron. And I think the cruel irony in that is the Dardanelles campaign, the whole of feasibility and the whole possibilities that he could have provided us with is all about maritime power. So the fact we overlook that naval component to really what is trying to open up one of the most significant waterways on the planet then, as it is now, is why we're there in the first place. And so, with my work, whenever I'm leading groups to the Western Front, I certainly give short shrift to anyone that I hear people describe Gallipoli as being Churchill's Folly. The end is that where the Australians are, they then get a 2.5 hour lecture on Gallipoli, even though they've paid to come to the Somme Reaps. So you know, I think we as an association probably overlook the naval component at our own peril as much as anything else. It's a very important part. And in 1915, if we're really honest, despite our pride in our local regiments, we are still a maritime power, and that is the best thing we can do for the Allies, is offer that naval ability to project force.
Yeah.
You know, there's not enough of us in the army trained up yet to make a difference anywhere else.
I think it certainly deserves more focus.
Mm. Yeah.
Okay. A comment from me. I think the maritime nature of Britain's war and the worldwide nature of the commitments brought home to me by us, the South Wales borderers. I can't remember which battalion it was. Stephen and the Dad will be able to tell me, that formed part of the 29th Division as they were heading towards before coming to the United Kingdom to be billeted in the Midlands. They stopped off at Tsingtao to join the Japanese.
Yeah, second battalion. Yeah.
To join an attack with the Japanese on the Germans there. The amazing sort of worldwide travels of the British Armed Forces. Right?
Yeah, I think that when you go to a Chinese restaurant now, you are often served Tsingtao Pilsner. And that dates from the German occupation after the Boxer Rebellion, taking out their Pilsner brewing techniques to that area of China so they could make decent beer. So there is a Great War legacy with that beer.
Yes, great. Yeah. Okay, any other questions? No, some very nice comments on the chat. Thank you, Clive, for a very interesting talk. Great talk. Thanks, Clive. Clive, thank you. Wonderful lecture, most interesting. Thank you for a fascinating talk.